Small earthquakes started shaking the ground in Antarctica. This had never happened before. Scientists around the world were surprised. They didn't know what was causing the shakes. NASA decided to send an expert to find out. They chose a famous geologist named George Zoraz. He had studied earthquakes for many years. If anyone could figure out the mystery, it was him. George was in his office when he got the call. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Antarctica never had earthquakes. It was the most stable place on Earth, but the reports were clear. The ground was shaking and nobody knew why. He felt excited. This could be a huge discovery. He agreed to go right away. George packed his equipment carefully. He needed seismometers, GPS trackers, and temperature sensors. He also packed warm clothes, food, and a tent. The journey would not be easy. Antarctica was one of the coldest places on Earth. The weather was harsh and the wind was strong, but George was ready. He had traveled to many dangerous places before. This was just another challenge. The flight to Antarctica took many hours. George sat by the window, looking at the endless white land below. There were no cities, no roads, just ice and snow. As the plane got closer, the temperature dropped. He put on his thick jacket. The pilot made an announcement. They would be landing soon. George felt his heart race. He had read about Antarctica many times, but now he was really there. When the plane landed, George stepped outside. The cold air hit his face like a sharp knife. His breath turned to fog. He pulled his jacket tighter. The sun was shining, but it did not bring any warmth. He looked around. There were a few small buildings in the distance. This was a research station. Scientists stayed here to study the ice and weather, but George was not staying at the station. His mission was deep in the ice. A snow vehicle was waiting for him. It had thick tires and a strong engine. The driver introduced himself. "Welcome to Antarctica, Mr. Zoraz," he said. "Hope you're ready for the cold." George smiled. He had no choice but to be ready. He loaded his equipment into the vehicle. Then they started moving across the ice. The drive took hours. The land was empty, quiet, and white. The sky was blue, but there were no birds, no animals, just ice. It felt like another world. George checked his GPS. They were getting close. After a while, the driver stopped. "This is as far as I can take you," he said. George nodded. He stepped out and looked around. The ground beneath him was shaking slightly. It was not strong, but it was there. The earthquakes were real. Without wasting time, he set up his tools. He placed seismometers in the ice to measure the shaking. He connected them to his laptop. Then he placed temperature sensors to check if the ice was melting. Days passed as he carefully studied the data. The earthquakes did not stop. In fact, they became stronger. Something was causing them. But what? Then he found something shocking. The earthquakes were coming from a huge mountain made of ice. George had never seen anything like it before. It was massive, taller than any building he had ever seen. Its sides were smooth, as if something had shaped them. The shaking was coming from deep inside the mountain. It made no sense. Mountains do not shake on their own. George knew he had to go there himself. He packed his bag, grabbed his flashlight, and started walking toward the mountain. The wind was strong, pushing against him. His feet sank into the snow. Each step was slow and heavy. The mountain was far, but he did not stop. He had to know what was inside. The sun was setting, and the sky turned dark. The temperature dropped even more. George's hands felt numb, even inside his gloves. He kept walking. After what felt like hours, he finally reached the mountain. He placed his hand on the icy surface. It was cold and solid, but he could feel something beneath it. A deep sound, like a distant growl. His heart pounded. What was inside this mountain? He was too tired to think. He needed rest. He set up his tent, climbed inside, and zipped it shut. The wind howled outside. He checked his laptop one last time. The shakes were still happening. Whatever was inside the mountain was moving. He took a deep breath. Tomorrow he would explore. But for now, he needed sleep. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind. He had no idea that the biggest discovery of his life was waiting just beneath the ice. In the middle of the night, another shake woke George up. He rubbed his eyes and looked around. Something was different this time. The shaking was stronger than before. It felt like the whole ground beneath him was moving. His tent trembled. Snow fell from the top of the mountain. The wind was silent, but a deep rumbling noise filled the air. It wasn't just the usual sound of ice cracking. It was something else. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The cold hit him instantly, but he barely noticed. His eyes widened as he looked at the mountain. A huge crack had formed in the ice. It stretched high up and was as wide as a bus is long. The ice around it looked smooth, as if something had forced its way from within. George took a deep breath, his heart pounding. Then, a strange, deep sound came from the crack. It didn't sound like ice breaking. It sounded like a growl. George stood frozen for a moment. His mind raced. Could an animal be inside? That made no sense. There were no large animals in Antarctica, and no animal could survive trapped in ice. But the sound was real. He could hear it clearly. It was low and heavy, like something breathing deep under the ice. He felt both scared and excited. This was something new, something no one had ever seen. He had to find out what was inside. If he turned back now, he would never forgive himself. Holding his flashlight, he slowly stepped forward. His boots crunched on the ice. His breath came out in short puffs. The crack was dark inside. The deeper part looked like a tunnel leading underground. He hesitated for a moment. His instincts told him to be careful, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He took a deep breath and walked in. The ice walls around him were massive, smooth, and cold. He touched one as he passed. It was solid, but there was something strange about it. It almost felt warm, as if something behind it was alive. His footsteps echoed as he moved deeper inside. The crack was much longer than he had expected. It didn't seem natural. It looked like something had broken free, or was trying to. He shined his flashlight on the walls. The ice was thick, but inside he saw something dark. It wasn't just frozen water. There were shapes buried inside, but he couldn't tell what they were. The tunnel twisted and turned. It felt like a never-ending path. He checked his watch. He had been walking for almost an hour. The deeper he went, the stronger the strange sound became. It was no longer just a growl. It was breathing, heavy, slow breathing. He swallowed hard. Whatever was inside was alive. He stepped carefully, his hands shaking slightly. The air inside the tunnel was warmer than outside. That was strange. The deeper he went, the more it felt like the ice was melting from within. The walls had cracks and drops of water dripped down. The sound of breathing filled his ears now. It was loud, rhythmic, and powerful. Then, suddenly, he saw it. George stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. Right in front of him was something he never imagined he would find. A massive figure was trapped inside the ice. It was enormous, at least 50 feet tall. Its body was dark, covered in thick scales. Its arms had huge claws. Its tail stretched far behind it. But what shocked George the most were the eyes. They were open, glowing faintly in the dim light. The creature was awake. It was Godzilla. George felt his legs tremble. He had seen pictures of Godzilla in movies, but this was real. It was not a story. It was here, buried beneath the ice. Its chest rose and fell slowly, matching the deep breathing he had heard. It was alive, but it was trapped. The ice held it like a prison. For a moment, George just stood there, staring. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. This was impossible. How could such a creature exist? How had it survived for so long under the ice? Then, he remembered his camera. His hands shook as he reached into his bag. He had to record this. He needed proof. No one would believe him without it. He carefully pulled out the camera and started filming. As he zoomed in on the creature's face, its eyes twitched. George's breath caught in his throat. Godzilla was waking up. A low, rumbling growl filled the air. The ice around the creature's mouth cracked slightly. Its claws flexed, pressing against the frozen walls. The breathing became louder, faster. The ground beneath George's feet vibrated. He took a step back. His heart pounded. He had come too close. The beast was trying to move. More cracks spread through the ice, climbing up the walls. The air felt even warmer now. George knew he had to leave. He had seen enough. But just as he turned to go, a loud crack echoed through the tunnel. A chunk of ice the size of a car broke off and crashed to the ground. The creature's arm moved slightly. It was breaking free. George's mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. He stood frozen, watching as the creature's fingers twitched. Another deep growl filled the air. Godzilla was not just trapped. It was waking up. George ran as fast as he could. His boots slid on the icy ground, but he forced himself forward. His breath was short and fast. His heart pounded in his chest. His camera was still recording, shaking in his hand. He didn't dare look back. The roaring behind him grew louder. The sound was deep, powerful, and terrifying. The entire tunnel shook. Large chunks of ice fell from the ceiling. Then, suddenly, a huge piece of ice crashed down in front of him, blocking his way. He skidded to a stop, nearly falling. His hands pressed against the ice wall, but there was no way through. He was trapped. Slowly, he turned around. His body stiffened with fear. Godzilla was almost free now. Its massive form moved as more ice cracked and fell away. Its eyes were glowing slightly, locked onto him. Its breath was heavy, fogging up the air. The creature shifted, breaking more of the frozen prison around it. Its huge claws flexed, its tail twitched. George's hands trembled as he held his camera up. His fingers felt numb. If this was his last moment, at least the world would know what had happened. He tried to steady his grip. He needed to capture this. He needed proof. For a brief second, everything was still. Then Godzilla's mouth opened wide. A deafening roar filled the air. The force of it sent a blast of wind through the tunnel. George felt it hit his chest like a hammer. His ears rang. The ice beneath him cracked. His knees nearly buckled. Then the creature lunged at him. The last thing the camera captured was a blur of movement. Then everything went dark. The video stopped recording. No one knows what happened to George after that. His last transmission had been brief, full of static. He had said only a few words. "Godzilla, it's waking up. I don't have much time." Then the signal cut off. A rescue team was sent to Antarctica days later. They searched the area carefully. The icy mountain was nearly destroyed. The crack in the ice had grown larger, stretching far beyond where it had first appeared. The ground was uneven, broken by deep gashes in the ice. Large footprints were frozen in the snow, each one massive. The team found George's broken equipment scattered around the site. His laptop was cracked. His camera was half buried in ice, the lens shattered. His tent was torn apart. His notes and research data were missing. But there was no sign of George, and there was no sign of Godzilla. Something huge had escaped. The news spread fast. Scientists debated what had happened. Some refused to believe the reports. Others studied the footage from George's camera, analyzing every frame. They could see the creature waking up, breaking free. They could hear the final roar before everything went dark. But none of them could explain where it had gone. Then, the world began to change. Strange tremors were reported in different parts of the world. At first, they were small, barely noticeable, but they grew stronger. Cities near oceans felt deep vibrations beneath them. Fishermen spoke of strange movements in the water. Some claimed they saw massive shadows beneath the waves. Then, people started hearing sounds. Deep, distant roars carried through the air. Some believed it was the wind. Others weren't so sure. Videos surfaced online, showing water shifting in unnatural ways. Earthquakes happened in places where they had never been recorded before. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed George had been taken by Godzilla. Others thought he had escaped and was hiding. But no one knew for sure. One thing was certain: the creature was free, and no one knew where Godzilla would appear next.